Yeah, not bad hymn, actually, that. Once we get it, it's quite good. Now, this story of the disciples in the boat, it's post-resurrection. It's really interesting, I think. And it's interesting for all kinds of reasons. Because after 3 years, 3 dramatic years of leaving their own old lives behind and following Jesus from place to place, after this huge risk they took, completely changing their way of life, taking part in teaching and healing with Jesus, learning from him every day, and after witnessing his death, but also his resurrection, and indeed they'd seen him on 2 separate occasions beforehand. After all that, what do the disciples do? They get back into their boat and start to fish. I suppose they had to eat. They were no longer living from the hospitality that people gave them in the villages that they preached and healed in. So needs must, I suppose. They went back to their boats. They started to fish again, back to what they knew, back to their old lives. But it didn't quite work out like that, because Jesus appears on the shore with one instruction. The disciples don't know it's Jesus at first, but the instruction is to cast their nets on the other side of the boat, the right hand rather than the left-hand side. It seemed a bit pointless. One side of a boat rather than another shouldn't really make any difference. But symbolically, Jesus was saying, do something different from what you know. You're not the same as you used to be. This isn't your old life. Try a different way and see what happens. There's definitely a message in that for 3 churches coming together to form a new church. Anyway, what happened when they did try something different was they got a bumper catch. And then they recognized Jesus. They saw Jesus. They saw who he was. They saw him on the shore. Change is good for the soul, I think. Some people don't like it. Sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes it can be hard to accept. It might even feel threatening. But it's good for the soul. And change that engages positively with circumstances in life is almost always, eventually, reviving and energizing if we allow it to be. Staying the same is one way towards a slow, incremental death. And that's a lesson that Church of Scotland sometimes is slow to learn. What happens after this change when the disciples bring their huge catch of fish onto the shore? Well, Jesus has set up a barbecue, a charcoal fire, in fact, and they cook the fish and they eat it with bread. It's a bit like a communion, isn't it? Not bread and wine, but bread and fish. Kind of similar. You imagine Jesus handing out this stuff. It's almost sacramental. It's a bonding meal. It's Jesus showing them that even after his death, God's power had not diminished. They were still one with him. Things had changed, but the disciples were no longer the same either. And if they carried on in that vein, ready to change and take risks and try new ways of doing things, then the gospel would spread and their movement would spiritually prosper. And as they gathered round the barbecue, there's quite a heartbreaking conversation between Jesus and Peter. 3 times, Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter must have been despondent by the time, well, he was. It says he was sad, he was hurt. Why does Jesus keep asking me this? He must have been thinking. Does Jesus not believe him? Does Jesus doubt Peter's real commitment to the cause? Do you love me? Yes, you know I love you, Peter replies, increasingly bewildered and frustrated and hurt. But of course, there was a reason for the threefold question. It was because when Jesus was hauled up to Pilate and was tried and then was sentenced to crucifixion and was put on the cross, Jesus had denied that he even knew Jesus, and he did it 3 times. And each time he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you, it's like it's cancelling out each denial. And Jesus says each time in response, take care of my sheep, or feed my sheep. He's restoring Peter from his state of being ashamed at his denials, because he would have been ashamed. And he's instead reinstating him as part of God's mission. That's what Jesus is essentially saying to Peter. By saying, feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, he's saying, you're restored. You're part of this. Peter denied 3 times. Then he declared his love 3 times. Then he's told he's part of God's plan, part of the future of the gospel being spread in word and action. And note this, that Peter's denials came when he was standing in the high priest's courtyard with servants and officials. And John chapter 18, verse 18 tells us, it was cold, and the servants and officials stood round a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was standing with them, warming himself. So he denies Jesus, first of all to a woman at the gate of the courtyard. Then he denies Jesus to an unnamed person around the fire who asks, you're not one of his disciples, are you? And Peter answers, I'm not, because he was afraid. And then one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man that Peter had cut the ear off at the Garden of Gethsemane. If you remember, when the people came to arrest Jesus, Peter takes a sword and he whacks the guy's ears off, and Jesus restores it. So this is a relative of that guy. He knows who Peter is. And he says, didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? And Peter denies it a 3rd time, flat out. And then the cock crows, just as Jesus had prophesied to him, and he must have felt such shame. He must have felt that he couldn't be part of the family anymore. So that was all down around this fire. So this charcoal fire that the disciples are gathered around, restored to the communion, the sacramental, almost communion of the fish and the bread with Jesus. It's not just an incidental detail, this charcoal fire. There are no unimportant details in John's Gospel. The charcoal fire is an echo of the fire that Peter stood around when he denied Jesus 3 times. But now the fire becomes the place of forgiveness and revival. It's the same kind of scene, but it's a transformed scene. Peter is transformed by Jesus. He's restored and changed, and he's given his commission again. Now, we all meet here to worship. For some, it's the same building they've worshipped in for a long time. For some, it can be the same minister. For some, it's neither. But there are recognisable elements in all the services. But for all of us, coming together to be a church, it's different. Subtle things maybe change, but people notice. Sometimes people grumble. Sometimes people like the change. There's all these different reactions. But we have to be new. We have to change, not just in our worship, but in the whole approach that we have outside as well, and the way that we go about what it means to be the church. We're a new church, and more than just a name. So breaking with old habits, embracing change, risking failure, entertaining possibility. That's the way forward. And it's the way in which Jesus will give us that same restoration and revive us when we trust in him now and for the future, just as Peter did. Amen.